The late September wind whipped through Isabella Martinez's dark hair, carrying the sharp scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke. She stood before the weathered Victorian house, her mother's final gift, feeling the bite of Nova Scotia's autumn, so different from San Diego's perpetual warmth. Her thin jacket offered little protection against the maritime chill, and beside her, 7-year-old Ethan shivered despite his new coat. "Is this really Grandma's house, Mom?" His voice barely carried over the rustle of maple leaves skittering across the unkempt lawn. The worn backpack clutched to his chest seemed more security blanket than school supply. Isabella forced herself to really look at the house. The pale blue paint peeled in long strips, revealing graying wood underneath. The wraparound porch sagged noticeably on the eastern corner, and thick cobwebs draped the windows like grimy lace curtains. 2 years of abandonment had left their mark. "Yes, honey, this is home now." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The move hadn't been a choice, not after the accounting firm's restructuring had left her jobless, and Ethan's lengthy hospitalization had drained their savings. The house represented their last chance, though she'd die before admitting that to her son. Gravel crunched behind them as Mrs. Peterson's Volvo pulled into the driveway. The real estate agent emerged, her silver hair whipping in the wind, keys jingling. "Sorry about the delay," she called out, her maritime accent thick and warm. "Accident on the McKay Bridge backed up everything." Isabella managed a smile, watching as Mrs. Peterson wrestled with the stubborn lock. The door finally surrendered with a groan, releasing a musty breath that carried hints of mothballs and old wood. The foyer looked smaller than Isabella remembered from childhood visits. Dust motes danced in weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. The curved wooden staircase leading upstairs bore scuff marks from decades of use, its banister dulled to a flat brown. White sheets draped the living room furniture like abandoned Halloween costumes, while the dining room stood empty except for her mother's cherry wood table, the one piece she'd refused to sell. "Utilities are all connected," Mrs. Peterson explained, handing over a ring of keys that felt impossibly heavy. "But get someone to check the furnace soon. Last winter dropped to -20, and this one's supposed to be worse." Isabella's throat tightened as reality settled over her like the dust coating every surface. This was it. Starting over at 35 with nothing but a rundown house and dwindling hope. "Can I pick my room?" Ethan's question cut through her spiral of anxiety. "Of course, sweetie. Just watch the stairs. They might be loose." His footsteps echoed overhead as Isabella allowed herself one moment of vulnerability. Tears pricked her eyes as she remembered her mother's final visit to San Diego. Elaine had begged her to return to Nova Scotia, insisting there were things they needed to discuss. But Isabella had been too focused on client meetings and deadlines to listen. Now, standing in her mother's house with their meager belongings in the rental truck outside, the weight of her choices pressed down like physical pain. 3 months of savings stood between them and complete disaster. Somehow, she had to turn this museum of memories into a functioning home while finding work in a town where she knew no one. A gust rattled the windows, and upstairs, Ethan called out about finding something in a closet. Isabella wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders. They had to start somewhere. Right now, that meant making this dusty old house livable. 2 weeks into their new life, Isabella sat at her mother's kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills by lamplight. October's early darkness pressed against the windows, and the house's unfamiliar creaks and groans made her jump despite herself. The silence felt oppressive after years of San Diego's constant urban hum. She'd spent days scrubbing the kitchen into submission. New refrigerator seals had replaced the crumbling rubber, and expired spices, some dating back to the 1990s, had been cleared from the pantry. Her mother's presence lingered everywhere, in the hand-painted tiles above the sink, in the precisely organized teacup collection, in the pencil marks on the doorframe tracking Isabella's childhood growth. "Mom?" Ethan's voice drifted from the living room, where he was supposed to be doing homework. "Did Grandma have any friends here?" Isabella set down her calculator, grateful for a break from calculating their dwindling funds. She found him curled into the corner of the sofa, math workbook abandoned, looking small against the faded floral upholstery. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Mrs. Chen next door said Grandma used to help at her restaurant, and Mr. Kennedy at the ice cream shop got really happy when I said my last name. But if she had friends, Why was she alone when she got sick? The question hit like a physical blow. Her mother had never mentioned feeling lonely during their weekly calls, but now Isabella wondered how much Elaine had hidden behind cheerful updates about her garden and book club. She wasn't alone, Isabella said carefully, sitting beside him. She had her friends. I was the one who stayed away. Because of my hospital bills? No, sweetheart. Long before that. I thought my life in California was more important than coming home to visit. That was my mistake, not yours. Ethan leaned against her, his thin frame still too light despite months of recovery. The kids at school said this house is haunted. They said no one's lived here since Grandma died. Well, we're living here now. Isabella pulled him closer. And the only ghosts are memories. Good ones, like how your grandmother used to make real hot chocolate on cold nights. Not the powdered kind. She melted actual chocolate with warm milk and cream. His eyes lit up. Can we make some... In the kitchen, Isabella found her mother's recipe box, its wooden surface smooth from years of handling. The cards inside were spotted with cooking stains, the handwriting achingly familiar. Together they measured and stirred, and soon rich chocolate scent replaced the lingering mustiness. Mom? Ethan watched the milk warm on the stove. Are you scared? Isabella paused in her stirring. What makes you ask that? You cry sometimes when you think I'm sleeping. Heat rushed to her face. She'd tried so hard to maintain a brave front, but last night's rejection letter from another job application had cracked her composure. Sometimes grown-ups get scared too, she admitted. But being scared doesn't mean we made the wrong choice. I like it here, Ethan said quietly. It smells like Grandma's sweaters. The simple observation brought fresh tears to Isabella's eyes. She'd been so focused on their financial struggles that she'd missed the comfort these walls offered. This house had sheltered 3 generations of her family. Maybe it could shelter them too. The storm arrived without warning on a Friday evening, bringing sheets of rain that drummed against the roof like marbles in a tin can. Isabella had just finished patching a leak in the upstairs hallway when she heard it. A distinct dripping sound from above, followed by Ethan's worried voice. Mom! Water's coming through the attic door! The pull-down attic stairs protested as Isabella climbed them, flashlight beam bouncing off dust-covered boxes and old furniture. Rain trickled in through a worn spot in the roof, forming a growing puddle on the wooden floorboards. Hand me that bucket, honey, she called down to Ethan. As she positioned it under the leak, her flashlight caught something odd, a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. After securing the bucket, Isabella investigated closer. The wallpaper there was slightly raised, concealing something underneath. Her fingers found a seam, and careful peeling revealed a small door set into the wall, no larger than a shoebox. Ethan, bring me the toolbox from downstairs, please. While waiting, Isabella examined the hidden panel. It was crafted from the same wood as the attic walls, expertly concealed. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would have found it. The thought sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold attic air. Ethan returned with the toolbox, his face flushed with excitement. Is it a secret passage, like in the movies? Let's find out. Isabella selected a screwdriver and worked on the rusted hinges. The door resisted at first, then gave way with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the storm-filled silence. Inside lay a metal lockbox covered in decades of dust. Beside it, a sealed envelope addressed simply to "My dearest daughter" in her mother's distinctive handwriting. Isabella's hands trembled as she lifted both items. The envelope's seal broke easily, revealing several pages of careful script. She began reading aloud, including Ethan in this moment of discovery. My dearest Isabella, if you're reading this, then you found your way home at last, just as I always hoped you would. There are things I should have told you years ago, but pride and circumstance kept me silent. Now, I must trust that this letter will find you when you need it most. The lockbox contains documents regarding your grandmother's estate, papers that could change everything for you and Ethan. Your grandmother, Lily, was more than the quiet bookshop owner you remember. She was a shrewd businesswoman who built an empire from nothing, investing in properties across Nova Scotia when land was cheap and opportunities were plenty. Monday morning found Isabella climbing the worn granite steps of McPherson and Associates law firm. Salt air drifted up from the harbor 2 blocks away, mixing with the scent of coffee from the cafe next door. The small practice occupied the second floor of a historic building, its windows offering glimpses of maple trees blazing with autumn colors. Sarah McPherson, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, studied the documents spread across her mahogany desk. Each time she turned a page, her eyebrows lifted slightly higher. Isabella sat rigid in her chair, her mother's letter clutched in her lap like a talisman. "Well, Mrs. Martinez," Sarah finally said, removing her reading glasses, "your grandmother was quite the strategist. These property holdings." She gestured to a stack of deeds. "We're looking at prime commercial properties in Halifax, vacation rentals in Peggy's Cove, and several undeveloped parcels along the coast. Conservative estimates would put the total value well into 8 figures. Isabella's hands began to shake. 8 figures. Your grandmother Lily bought most of these properties in the 1970s when coastal real estate was practically being given away. She had an eye for potential. The trust fund she established is equally impressive, professionally managed, with strict provisions for its distribution. What kind of provisions? Sarah consulted a document. The primary condition was age. You had to reach 35. There are also stipulations about residing in Maplewood for a minimum of 6 months before claiming the full inheritance. She paused, frowning slightly. However, there might be complications. Isabella's heart sank. What complications? These properties have been managed by a trust company in Toronto for the past decade. They'll need to verify everything, and there might be other interested parties who'll want to review the documentation. Inheritance cases like this can become contentious. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed. Her secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ms. McPherson, there's a Mr. Thompson from Blackwood Legal in Toronto on line 1. He's asking about the Martinez estate." Sarah's expression tightened. She took the call on speakerphone, allowing Isabella to listen. "Sarah McPherson speaking." A smooth male voice filled the room. "Sarah, Derek Thompson here. I understand you're meeting with Isabella Martinez regarding the Lily Haven estate. That's privileged information, Derek." Of course. I just wanted to give you a heads up. We'll be filing a challenge to any claim she makes. Our firm represents interests that predate the trust's establishment. I'm sure you understand." After ending the call, Sarah turned to Isabella with concern. "Derek Thompson has a reputation for being aggressive in estate cases. If he's involved, we need to prepare for a fight." Isabella stared out the window at the maple trees, their leaves trembling in the October wind. "I don't understand. Who would challenge this? My mother's letter said everything was left to me. Sometimes, Mrs. Martinez, inheritance cases reveal family histories we never knew existed." Sarah began organizing the documents into a folder. "For now, I suggest we focus on establishing your residency requirement. Keep living in the house, get involved in the community, and let me handle the legal aspects." On the walk home, Isabella's mind raced. The morning's revelations felt surreal. The wealth her grandmother had accumulated, the mysterious challenger to her inheritance, the possibility that her family's history held secrets she'd never suspected. She picked up Ethan from school early, needing the comfort of his presence. They walked through town together, past the small shops and cafes that lined Main Street. Every building held new significance now. Any of these could be part of her grandmother's legacy. "Can we get ice cream?" Ethan asked, pointing to Haven's Creamery, a charming shop with a striped awning. Isabella stopped short, staring at the shop's name. "Haven's," she whispered. Her grandmother's maiden name had been Haven. Could this be one of the properties mentioned in the documents? Inside, an elderly man behind the counter greeted them warmly. "Welcome to Haven's. First time here." "Actually," Isabella said, "I'm Isabella Martinez. Lily Haven was my grandmother." The man's face lit up with recognition. "Little Isabella, I haven't seen you since you were knee-high. I'm George Kennedy. I used to manage this shop for your grandmother back in the day. Still do, matter of fact, though the trust company owns it now." As George served them generous scoops of maple walnut ice cream on the house, he shared stories about Lily Haven, how she'd given him a chance when no one else would, how she'd helped other small business owners get their start. "Your grandmother believed in building community," George said, his eyes misty with memories. "She wasn't just buying properties, she was investing in people's dreams." Walking home, hand in hand with Ethan, Isabella felt the weight of her grandmother's legacy settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about money or properties. It was about family, community, and the kind of person she wanted to be. "Mom," Ethan said, ice cream smeared around his mouth. "Are we rich now?" Isabella squeezed his hand. "I don't know, sweetie, but I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be." As they approached their house, Isabella noticed a black luxury car parked across the street, its Toronto license plate gleaming in the afternoon sun. Through the tinted windows, she could make out the silhouette of someone watching their home. The sight sent a chill down her spine, reminding her of Sarah's warning. Whatever came next, she had a feeling their quiet life in Maplewood was about to become considerably more complicated. The black car appeared again the next morning, this time parked directly in front of their house. Isabella watched from behind the living room curtains as a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit emerged, his leather briefcase gleaming in the morning sun. His confident stride up their walkway spoke of someone accustomed to getting his way. The doorbell chimed, and Isabella straightened her simple blouse, grateful she'd already sent Ethan off to school. She opened the door, maintaining what she hoped was a composed expression. "Mrs. Martinez." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Derek Thompson from Blackwood Legal in Toronto. I believe we should talk." Isabella's throat tightened, but she remembered Sarah McPherson's advice from their morning phone call. "Don't engage in any discussions without me present." She gripped the doorframe. "Any discussions should go through my lawyer, Mr. Thompson. Please." He held up his hands in a gesture of peace that felt rehearsed. "I'm just here to have a friendly conversation. Perhaps save everyone some time and unnecessary legal fees." Before Isabella could respond, Mrs. Chen called out from her garden, "Everything okay, Isabella?" The elderly woman's presence was reassuring, a reminder that in Maplewood, neighbors looked out for each other. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Chen, thank you." Isabella turned back to Thompson. "My answer stands. Contact Sarah McPherson's office." Thompson's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "You know, your grandmother Lily wasn't the saint everyone in this town believes she was. There are things about her past, about this inheritance, that could be quite damaging if made public. Is that a threat, Mr. Thompson?" "A friendly warning. The trust company I represent has managed these properties for years. They have certain expectations about their continued involvement." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick envelope. "Inside is a very generous offer to settle this matter quietly. I suggest you review it." Isabella didn't take the envelope. "I think you should leave." "Mrs. Martinez," his voice hardened, "you're a single mother with limited resources. Do you really want to engage in a lengthy legal battle? One that could drain whatever savings you have left?" The mention of her financial situation, information he shouldn't have known, sent anger coursing through her veins. "You've obviously done your research, Mr. Thompson. Then you know I'm exactly like my grandmother. I don't respond well to intimidation." A car door slammed behind them, and Isabella saw Sarah McPherson striding up the walkway, her face tight with concern. "I thought I might find you here, Derek. Attempting to speak to my client directly? The Bar Association might have something to say about that." Thompson's smile returned, shark-like. "Sarah, always a pleasure. Just having a neighborly chat. Leave the premises, Derek. Any further communication goes through me." After Thompson departed, Sarah turned to Isabella. "I came as soon as Mrs. Chen called my office. Small towns," she smiled warmly. "Word travels fast when strangers start asking questions." Inside, Isabella's hands shook as she made tea. "He knew about my financial situation. He's been investigating me." "Standard intimidation tactics," Sarah assured her, accepting a cup. "But his involvement confirms my suspicions. This is bigger than just your grandmother's properties." "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, bringing up several news articles. "I've been doing some digging. The trust company Thompson represents, Haven Holdings, they've been acquiring small-town properties all along the coast, converting them into luxury developments. Your grandmother's properties are some of the few they don't control." Isabella sank into a kitchen chair. "So this isn't really about inheritance law?" "No." Sarah's expression was grim. "This is about power and money. Your grandmother's properties are the missing pieces in their development plans. They probably assumed the trust would eventually sell to them, until you showed up." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Through the window, Isabella could see her mother's garden, the rose bushes still blooming despite the autumn chill. This house, this town, had become more than just a refuge. It was her heritage, her home. "What do we do now?" Sarah's eyes sparkled with determination. We fight. Thompson's threats suggest they're worried. Your grandmother's documents are legally sound, and your claim is strong. But, she hesitated, we need to be prepared. They'll dig into everything, your past, your finances, anything they can use against you. I have nothing to hide. Good. Because there's something else you should know. Sarah pulled another document from her briefcase. I found this in the county records this morning. In 1975, your grandmother helped several local businesses avoid bankruptcy by offering them partnerships rather than foreclosure. Those partnership agreements included provisions that the properties could never be sold to development corporations without unanimous approval from all original partners, heirs. Isabella leaned forward. What does that mean? It means, my dear, that your grandmother didn't just leave you property. She left you a legacy of protecting this community. Those development plans Thompson's clients have, they can't happen without your consent. As Sarah's words sank in, Isabella felt a surge of understanding. Her grandmother hadn't just been a savvy businesswoman, she'd been a guardian of Maplewood itself. Now that role had passed to her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the kitchen floor, and somewhere in the distance, a school bell rang. Soon, Ethan would be home, full of stories about his day. Isabella thought about the future she wanted for him, not just financial security, but a community that cared, a place that felt like home. Thompson's right about one thing, Isabella said finally. I don't have many resources. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You have more than you know. You have the truth, the law, and an entire town of people who remember your grandmother's kindness. Sometimes, that's all you need. The Halifax County Courthouse loomed before Isabella, its granite facade stern against the November sky. Inside her briefcase were the original documents from the attic, each one carefully preserved in protective sleeves. Sarah walked beside her, their footsteps echoing on the marble floors as they made their way to courtroom 3. Remember, Sarah murmured, Thompson's going to try to rattle you. Stay calm, speak clearly, and stick to the facts. The courtroom was already half full. Isabella recognized several faces from Maplewood George Kennedy from the ice cream shop, Mrs. Chen, and other neighbors who'd made the hour-long drive to show support. Their presence steadied her nerves as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Derek Thompson sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 junior lawyers. He'd traded his intimidating manner for a mask of professional courtesy, but Isabella caught the predatory gleam in his eyes as Judge Margaret Sullivan entered the courtroom. All rise, the bailiff called out. Judge Sullivan, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed the preliminary documents. This is a hearing regarding the contested inheritance of the Lilyhaven estate. Mr. Thompson, you may present your challenge. Thompson rose smoothly. Your Honor, we contend that the trust established by Lilyhaven was superseded by subsequent agreements with Haven Holdings. We have evidence that Mrs. Haven intended to sell her properties to our client before her death. Objection, Your Honor, Sarah interrupted. No such evidence has been presented during discovery. Sustained. Judge Sullivan fixed Thompson with a stern look. Mr. Thompson, proceed with documented facts only. For the next hour, Thompson presented a carefully crafted narrative of corporate agreements and implied contracts. He called witnesses from Haven Holdings who spoke about meetings with Lilyhaven, though none could produce written documentation of these alleged discussions. When it was Sarah's turn, she approached the bench with quiet confidence. Your Honor, I'd like to call Isabella Martinez to the stand. Isabella's heart pounded as she took the oath. The wooden witness chair creaked as she sat, and she forced herself to look directly at the judge. Mrs. Martinez, Sarah began, when did you first learn about your inheritance? 6 weeks ago, when I found documents in a hidden compartment in my mother's house. Isabella described the discovery, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her mother's letter and the family legacy she'd uncovered. And why did you move to Maplewood? I lost my job in San Diego. My son had been sick, and the medical bills. Isabella paused, swallowing hard. The house was all we had left. I didn't know about the inheritance when we came here. I just knew it was home. Thompson's cross-examination was aggressive. Isn't it convenient, Mrs. Martinez, that you discovered these documents just when you were most desperate for money? Objection, Sarah called out. Argumentative. Sustained. Judge Sullivan warned. "Mr. Thompson, mind your tone." Thompson switched tactics. "Mrs. Martinez, can you explain why you had no contact with your grandmother in the years before her death?" Isabella felt a flash of shame, but answered honestly. "I was focused on my career, on building a life in California. It's my biggest regret, not making time for family until it was too late." "So you abandoned your family, and now you want to claim their wealth?" "Objection. Withdrawn," Thompson said smoothly. But the damage was done. Isabella felt tears threatening and blinked them back. During the lunch recess, Sarah led Isabella to a quiet corner of the courthouse. "You're doing well," she assured her. "This afternoon, we present our documentation. That's where we're strongest." When court resumed, Sarah methodically presented the original trust documents, partnership agreements, and property deeds. She called George Kennedy to testify about Lily Haven's business practices and community involvement. "Mrs. Haven saved my business," George testified, his voice thick with emotion. "She made all her partners promise never to sell to big developers. She believed in keeping Maplewood's character intact." Thompson objected repeatedly, but Judge Sullivan allowed the testimony. The afternoon wore on, and Isabella watched the judge's expression carefully as more evidence was presented. Finally, Thompson played what he clearly thought was his trump card. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Martinez has significant unpaid medical debts in California. She's clearly not financially qualified to manage these properties." Before Sarah could object, Judge Sullivan spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, are you suggesting that having faced financial hardship disqualifies someone from receiving their rightful inheritance?" "No, Your Honor, but—" "Then I fail to see the relevance." The judge's tone was sharp. "This court is concerned with the legality of the inheritance claims, not the recipient's bank balance." In her closing argument, Sarah spoke passionately about Lily Haven's legacy. "This isn't just about property rights," she concluded. "It's about preserving a community's character and fulfilling a grandmother's wishes for her family's future." Judge Sullivan took only 30 minutes to reach her decision. Isabella held her breath as the older woman adjusted her glasses. "Having reviewed all evidence presented, this court finds no merit in the challenge to Mrs. Martinez's inheritance claim. The trust established by Lily Haven is legally binding, and all properties and assets are to be transferred to Mrs. Martinez's control, subject to the residency requirements and partnership agreements already in place." The judge's gavel fell with a decisive crack, and Isabella felt tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. Around her, the Maplewood residents burst into applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff. Thompson was already gathering his papers, his face tight with controlled anger. But Isabella barely noticed him. She was surrounded by her neighbors, her community, all offering hugs and congratulations. "Your grandmother would be proud," George Kennedy said, his eyes twinkling. "You stood your ground, just like she always did." Despite the courtroom victory, the weeks that followed brought unexpected challenges. Isabella sat at her mother's kitchen table late one evening, surrounded by property management documents, her laptop screen glowing with unanswered emails. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 10, and she realized with a pang of guilt that she'd missed Ethan's bedtime story, again. She found him still awake, lying in bed with his reading light on, clutching the worn copy of The Little Prince they'd brought from San Diego. "Hey, sweetie," she said softly, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I'm sorry I missed our story time." Ethan didn't look at her. "It's okay. You're always busy now." The hurt in his voice cut deep. Since the court hearing, she'd been overwhelmed with managing the inherited properties, meeting with business partners, and learning the complexities of her grandmother's empire. Somewhere in the chaos, she'd started losing touch with what mattered most. "I had a meeting with Mr. Kennedy about the ice cream shop," she explained, reaching for his hand. He pulled away. "You always have meetings." His lower lip trembled. "You don't even pick me up from school anymore. Mrs. Chen does." "Ethan, I want to go back to San Diego," he burst out, tears spilling down his cheeks. "At least there you were just my mom." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on protecting their future that she'd neglected their present. The inheritance that was meant to secure their life was threatening to tear it apart. "Look at me, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaking. When he finally met her eyes, she saw not just sadness, but fear. The same fear she'd seen when they'd first arrived in Maplewood. You're right. I've been so wrapped up in everything else that I forgot what's most important. She pulled him into her arms, and this time he didn't resist. His small body shook with sobs. I miss you, he whispered into her shoulder. I miss you too, so much. She stroked his hair, remembering how her own mother had done the same for her. What if we made some changes? Real ones, not just promises. Ethan pulled back slightly, wiping his eyes. What kind of changes? Well, first I'm going to start picking you up from school again, every day, and we'll have dinner together. No phones, no laptops, just us. Can we still have hot chocolate sometimes? Like Grandma's recipe? Whenever you want. She smiled, then grew serious. But I need you to understand something. What we're doing here, managing Grandma Lily's properties, helping the community, it's important. Not just for us, but for all the people who depend on these businesses. I can't walk away from that responsibility. Over the next few days, Isabella began reorganizing her life. She called Sarah McPherson for advice on setting up a proper management structure. I need help finding balance, she explained. Something that lets me oversee everything without getting lost in the details. I was wondering when you'd reach this point, Sarah replied. Your grandmother had the same realization years ago. That's why she created the partnership system, to share the responsibility while maintaining oversight. Isabella established regular business hours, delegated more responsibilities to trusted partners like George Kennedy, and most importantly, created clear boundaries between work and family time. The changes weren't easy. Some partners resisted the new structure, and there were still urgent issues that demanded her attention. But she stuck to her commitment to Ethan. She was there to help with homework, to hear about his day, to make hot chocolate on cold evenings. Gradually, she saw the fear leave his eyes, replaced by a growing confidence. One afternoon, as they walked home from school together, Ethan spotted Derek Thompson's black car parked near their house again. Is he still trying to cause trouble? Ethan asked, gripping her hand tighter. Isabella squared her shoulders. Some people don't give up easily, but neither do we. Because we're Havens? Because we're family, she corrected gently. And family comes first. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table doing homework and reviewing property reports respectively, Isabella watched her son's face in the warm lamplight. He was humming softly as he worked on his math problems, completely at ease. The sight filled her with a profound sense of peace. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the windowsills with white. Isabella thought about her mother, her grandmother, and all the choices they'd made to protect what mattered most. She was beginning to understand that the true inheritance wasn't in the properties or the bank accounts. It was in the wisdom to know what really counted. A December morning found Isabella sorting through boxes in her grandmother's study, a room she'd been avoiding since their arrival. The dark wood paneling and heavy curtains made it feel like stepping into the past. Ethan sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, helping her organize old photographs and documents. Mom, look at this. He held up a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1975. The headline read, Local Businesswoman Stands Against Corporate Takeover. Isabella took the article, her eyes widening as she read. The story detailed how Lily Haven had organized local business owners to resist a hostile takeover attempt by Atlantic Development Corporation, the predecessor to Haven Holdings. They've been trying to get these properties for decades, she murmured, pieces clicking into place. Deeper in the box, they found more articles, along with letters and photographs. One envelope contained correspondence between Lily and various business owners, discussing their fears about losing their livelihoods to corporate development. What's this? Ethan pulled out a thick manila envelope marked Confidential in red ink. The documents inside revealed that Haven Holdings had been created by former executives of Atlantic Development Corporation, the same people who had tried to force out local businesses in the 1970s. They'd simply changed their name and tactics, but their goal remained the same: acquiring and developing coastal properties regardless of community impact. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah McPherson. Need to meet urgently. Found connection between Thompson and Old Atlantic Development. His grandfather was CEO. At Sarah's office, the lawyer's usually calm demeanor was shaken. Derek Thompson isn't just Haven Holdings' lawyer. He's carrying on a family vendetta. His grandfather was the CEO who tried to take over Maplewood's businesses in 1975. Your grandmother stopped him. This is personal for him, Isabella realized. Very. And there's more. Sarah pulled up several documents. Haven Holdings has been buying properties through shell companies, circumventing local ownership laws. They're planning a massive resort development that would essentially erase Maplewood as we know it. Before Isabella could respond, George Kennedy burst into the office, his face flushed. They're trying to force us out. Haven Holdings just bought the mortgage on my building. They're threatening to triple the rent. Isabella stood, anger replacing shock. No, this stops now. She turned to Sarah. Can you get us a meeting with the state attorney general? With this evidence? Absolutely. Over the next week, Isabella worked tirelessly, but differently than before. She maintained her promise to Ethan, picking him up from school and maintaining their evening routines. But late at night, after he was asleep, she and Sarah built their case. The final confrontation took place in the Attorney General's office. Thompson arrived with his usual confidence, but it crumbled as Isabella presented decades of evidence showing Haven Holdings' predatory practices. Your grandfather tried to destroy this town, Isabella said, meeting Thompson's gaze. My grandmother stopped him. Now you're trying to finish what he started, but I'm offering you something they never considered, a chance to walk away with dignity. The Attorney General's intervention was swift. Haven Holdings was forced to divest all Maplewood interests, their development plans permanently blocked by new regulations protecting historic coastal communities. Spring came early to Maplewood that year. Isabella stood in her mother's garden, now truly her garden, watching crocuses push through melting snow. The rose bushes needed pruning, but like everything else in their life, it was a labor of love. Mom! Ethan called from the kitchen. Mr. Kennedy says I can start learning to make the special flavors. She smiled, remembering her grandmother's words from one of the letters they'd found. Success isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the communities we build. The garden would need work, but that was okay. They had time now, time to grow, to learn, to build something meaningful. Isabella had finally understood what her grandmother had known all along. Some things were worth more than money, and the greatest inheritance was the wisdom to recognize them. Inside, Ethan was already wearing his New Haven's Creamery apron, proudly embroidered with his name. The kitchen smelled of melting chocolate. He was practicing Grandma's hot chocolate recipe again. You know what, Mom? He said, carefully stirring the mixture. I think Grandma Lily would be happy we're here. Isabella hugged him from behind, breathing in the sweet scent of chocolate and home. I think she knew we would be, sweetheart. I think she knew all along. Outside, spring sunshine warmed the awakening garden, and somewhere in town, the old church bells chimed. Isabella thought about the journey that had brought them here, not just the physical move from San Diego, but the emotional path from desperation to purpose. They had protected more than just buildings and businesses. They had preserved a way of life, a community where people still knew their neighbors, where success was measured not just in profits, but in the strength of relationships. The inheritance hadn't just secured their future. It had given them roots, purpose, and most importantly, a place to call home. In the end, that was Lily Haven's greatest gift. Not the properties or the wealth, but the understanding that true legacy lives in the hearts of those we touch and the communities we build. What did you think of the story? Please leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will surprise you. Give it a like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.